What you have to understand about people who have a more avoidant type of attachment pattern, or who engage in really what they are distancing strategies, moving away from intimacy and vulnerability, is that for many of them in childhood, they learned very early on that no one was coming to manage all of their big feelings. And in fact, they may have been rewarded for being big kids who were independent and old souls who were able to manage their feelings and take care of themselves and basically internalize a lot of intense emotions, especially negative emotions around things like crying and anger. In fact, the research shows that these types of parents with these patterns didn't necessarily like negative emotions, and so they would really unconsciously, in many regards, reinforce autonomy and independence. And so when these kids were playing quietly next to them on their own or in their room for hours on end, these parents were like, that's great, you're taking care of yourself. And there is something to be said for autonomy. But the dilemma for avoidant attachment is that autonomy has become a coping strategy. And in fact, we call it it's like fake autonomy. Like, I've got this myself, And the reason why is that behavior makes us feel the most safe in our adult lives. I get it myself. I can take care of myself. It's often very reminiscent of childhood. And it is actually when, I think for so many of us who have these patterns or tendencies, I would say I have both anxious and avoidant. I wouldn't characterize myself as extremely disorganized, but I can definitely have wide swings because of my really eggshell type parents. So that, sometimes I can want to distance when I feel like it's too much. Other times I can become hyper-focused, for example, on, where's that person going? What does that text message mean? How many emojis are there, as I always talk about? But going back to this one, if you didn't get the other part, where you just have mostly deactivating strategies, because you learned in childhood that what the literature calls repeated maternal rejection, because remember, the studies were done with mothers back in those days, although we still know that primarily mothers do the bulk of the attachment caregiving. Anyone can do the caregiving, the primary caregiving, but that's where the research was done. And so repeated maternal rejection, it doesn't mean that they were rejected, get away from me directly. It means that the child's bids for connection, their needs, what does that mean? Their needs to be soothed, their needs to be seen when they were crying or angry or validated, their needs to be maybe physically taken care of, that those bids for connection or need were often dismissed. Oh, you don't need my help, you're a big kid, you can handle that. Or go to your room and don't come out till you're done crying. So those bids, I need you, were dismissed. And the child interprets that as rejection. So that is why we talk about repeated maternal rejection. So going back to deactivating, what we've learned is that activating, which is actually hyperactivation, which is more anxious attachment, that is not going to be a comfortable strategy for us. And so that's why in early relationships, people who have these styles they're not going necessarily to seem avoidant. They might be very, lovey and engaging and responsive because there's nothing on the line. But when emotions get involved, when vulnerability and connection start to happen, that becomes too close, too dangerous. And my coping strategy to survive in my body, in my nervous system, as much as in my relationships, because remember, attachment theory and the nervous system theories, they're like this, right? They hold hands. Because when you're a child, you're born, you come out of the womb, however you come out, or whatever happens, and you meet your caregiver's nervous system, their nervous system patterns, and their attachment patterns. And then you develop, alongside genetics and temperament and things like that, ways to respond best to those caregivers to get your needs met. So deactivation becomes a very easy way to unconsciously protect ourselves. And maybe you're not avoidant, but you have these patterns. Maybe your partner is, but it's really important to recognize, for those of you who want to work on your avoidance strategies to become less avoidant, to know when you're doing it, okay? So it's not so simple as, oh, my partner's being emotional and vulnerable and I want to leave. That it may be, but usually what happens is something gets conveyed where there's a neediness or a space violation. You're too close physically, mentally, emotionally, and I have to find a way to distance. So how do I do that? Number one, I might do it by never really deciding that we're actually in a relationship. I don't really ever commit. Even though we are basically in a situationship/relationship, I can't say that, because to commit to you means I'm committing to being in this with you. And what I learned is that not committing to anybody but myself is the best strategy. Number two, focusing, and this is very common. I have worked with a lot of people. To be honest, a lot of men have reached out to me in the last several years when I started making videos on this topic. And what they will do, and they know this because they watch videos and they read books and they're so good at it, but they have a hard time not doing it, is they start to hyper focus on little imperfections of the partner. So, he or she or they are, a little bit too, focused on their pets, or he or she or they are too, focused on their looks, or they're not smart enough, or they didn't have this kind of degree, or they don't have a career, or they're not the same field. Like, they will find the littlest things. And the problem with people who have strong avoidant patterns in the dating pool is that they often can end up really single for the majority of their lives, because their acceptable list of dating, especially with like apps where they can check boxes, it really rules out a lot of really great people. So a lot of my work with them is also helping them widen, who they let into their life, and understanding that no one is perfect. No one's going to have all the boxes checked. And it's not that they want perfection, it's just that they've become, and as people age, they get more rigid. So between these strategies of distancing and the years that go by, it makes it more difficult for them. They can become more and more avoidant. The next thing is they will often have this, and all this comes also from the book Attached, from the textbook on treating adult attachment disturbances that I use, from Stan Tatkin's work, but they will have this like fantasy ex, the one that got away, the one that they can never let go of. And they will like live in relationship, like a limerence dynamic for forever, right, with this person. It's like the person has become bigger than who they are. And when you really go into the relationship to unpack what happened, it's not a good partner for them. It wasn't. In fact, many of them were sacrificing their needs and staying in these relationships once they were in them. Or, like I said earlier, they weren't ever giving anyone a chance. They had just enough time to connect with somebody, like 3 to 6 months, and then that fantasy ex becomes like the pinnacle. Meanwhile, when you really get down to it, it's not a good choice for them. They might do things like sabotage your sense of safety with them by being overly flirtatious with somebody, by texting stories to somebody. Many of them have relationships with people in their phone that they don't know, whether it's through social media, fantasizing about the excessive amount of other humans that come across their feed. And no matter how great their partner is, there's always a part of them that thinks, oh, I could just get someone a little bit better, and maybe this girl or this guy or this person is going to be a better fit for me. And there's a very complex relationship between imagery and content and our fantasy life, intimately and otherwise. And so that can really become confusing. Why am I not able to ever focus on my partner? Another way to distance ourselves. They can kind of pull away right when you need them most. And so maybe you've had a loss in the family or something's happening and they've been great till that point, and now all of a sudden they have to work a lot, right? Or they have this big project they can't miss, or they've committed to some trip with a friend. But whatever it is, it's a way to distance themselves from getting in that deep emotional pool with you. They might do things like when you're trying to connect with them and talk to them, it's like all of a sudden they're somewhere else, they're checked out, or they're on their phone too much. I think the phone is a very easy place for all of us, but it is really an easy place to lose yourself in and say, oh, I'm listening. They have a hard time sometimes with face-to-face, eye-to-eye contact. It can be very uncomfortable for them because that direct hit of intimacy feels so threatening. And if you think about probably the lack of direct eye contact they may have received if a parent was shuffling them from one thing to the next or not engaging with emotions, you can see why, like on every level in their body, it's uncomfortable. They might do things like keep secrets from you, make it kind of suspicious, like what's really going on, or leave out details. It's like, well, wait a minute, I thought you said this. And I'm like, no, I said that. And it can feel kind of like gaslighting. And in some cases, of course, it can be. But also for them, remember in childhood, a lot of what happens, which we know memory in childhood is complicated for all of us, but for kids who have this kind of pattern, memories and encoding emotion go together, right? So the more intense the emotion is, it's like while we have the imprint of trauma often, there's intense emotion, there's a physical and emotional reaction, and that can really create strong memory. But if you've learned to shut down emotion because that wasn't a safe place for you to go, it can make memory access difficult, right? So all of that can affect the exposure to memories and emotions and how they engage. And so they can actually be foggy about a lot of things. In fact, in therapy, it's very common, at least in my experience, when we start talking about childhood, for them to actually say, you know, I'm getting kind of foggy right now, the minute we start to hit deep emotional content. And it's not that they're trying to distract themselves or me. It's that literally it's like a kind of like a dissociative fog kind of like rolls in. Even the idea of expressing and connecting to those deep and profound and often painful emotions in therapy, it's like there's a protective system the body is providing for them, right? It's like, I can't go there, that's too much. And then the last thing is they can do things like not be very affectionate, be affectionate only on conditional circumstances, say they hate PDA, which, I mean, look, everyone has a different tolerance for that, but there's something about like intimacy has a purpose for many of them. And so when it comes into non-intimate, affection, whether it's like rubbing your head or brushing your hair or whatever, some of that can be very threatening for them because it's forcing them to connect to a softness, to a vulnerability, to a need, to a very repressed need that so many of them have had. So there are more of these. There are a lot of distancing type strategies and deactivating strategies we can use. And you may find that you just do a few of these, right? That you don't do all of them. It doesn't mean that that's a bad thing, but if you don't start to recognize, oh, I'm doing that thing again. And if this is you, I would encourage you, if you have this pattern, to share this with your partner if you're in a relationship, to write down if you have these patterns, which of these you relate to and add any more. If you're single, to try to think about how often you're doing this, to try to start paying attention to how often you like literally metaphorically lean back and pull yourself out. Isolating is a very common strategy for those of us who have this. And I think many of us who have avoidant and anxious, if our parents were chaotic and eggshell, we are avoidant in our body's response to the chaos. And so the only way that we learned to deal with the stimulation inside of the nervous system, because we had like yelling, screaming parents, as opposed to emotionally neglectful parents, let's say in a classic shutdown avoidant pattern, is that isolating and removing ourselves is another strategy to deal with it in a different way. So it doesn't necessarily mean that if your partner is avoidant, oh, they had an emotionally neglectful, lonely childhood. They probably had a emotionally lonely childhood, and technically neglectful in the idea that they weren't cared for. But it doesn't mean, in fact, many of them I've worked with have had very intense parents, a parent who yelled and screamed a lot, a controlling parent, and they don't have as many anxious qualities, but they only feel safe in their body when they are alone on their phone in that some kind of like dreamy auto-regulatory state of aloneness. And so if that's you, obviously you're not going to change your nervous system overnight. You want to work up to learning to tolerate connection. Like I said, make a list of the things that you do if you do this and start to challenge yourself. Certainly therapy can be incredibly helpful because that's a very vulnerable experience for many people, many of whom which have not had that kind of intimacy in a healthy relational way. And so it's really important to know that there are things you can do to work on this, but you have to be more mindful and aware and let your partner know, like I was saying, like, hey, you're doing it again. Maybe it's just a gentle touch. A lot of the literature says, we don't do well when you yell our names from another room because we're in that auto-regulatory state. So things like coming up and putting your hand on your partner's shoulder and being like, hey, babe, I need to talk to you in a few minutes. Let me know when you're done with whatever you're doing. There is a gentleness because of that nervous system response, regardless of where it came from. It's very highly walled up protected. And so we want to work on that. And lastly, if you're single and you have avoidant style, you're like, oh, I do have this pattern. Remember, it's a pattern. It's not a lockdown, you're this bad or wrong thing. It's just how you learn to survive. But if you are in the dating pool, I would encourage you to challenge yourself, to challenge some of the ideas you have about what's acceptable, what's not, how you can find ways, even in dating, to say, well, there's just nobody good for me, because it's really another protective strategy, because it's really terrifying to imagine being in that kind of relationship where you have to put your heart and soul on the line. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to go back and do some more attachment content, I think, here in the near future. But I appreciate you so much. Please stay safe and well, and I'll see you soon.